In early April, Netflix released their new Our Planet documentary series narrated by veteran broadcaster Sir David Attenborough.
This series will celebrate the natural wonders that remain and reveal what we must preserve to ensure people and nature thrive.
One sequence in episode 2 featured walruses bouncing helplessly to their deaths from the top of a rocky cliff, which Attenborough said was the result of a lack of sea ice caused by global warming.
In their desperation to do so, hundreds fall from heights they should never have scaled.
The footage horrified sensitive viewers, and of course this was the point. But as we'll see, it turns out that there was rather more going on that day than Sir David and the producers would like you to know about, and the resulting backlash seems to have caught them by surprise.
A mother is holding her newborn young. It's dead.
Dying animals have always been a stock in trade of the wildlife documentary maker, particularly campaigning ones. The aim is to spark outrage and to shock viewers into taking action. Filmmakers hope that viewers who are well connected on social media and become distressed and angry about the images can be counted on to spread the climate change message.
Animals help us in the environment, and if we don't have any animals, we wouldn't really be able to survive.
The World Wildlife Fund, who are co-producers of the Netflix show, are currently promoting walruses as the new symbol of climate change, which is a pity because most of what Sir David told viewers turns out to be a fabrication, a tall tale that is little more than fantasy. Records show that ice-free periods along that Siberian coast happened many times in early fall as far back as the 19th century. And when they did, walrus females came ashore with their calves to rest at beach haulouts between periods of feeding. Decades ago, well before declining sea ice was an issue, enormous walrus herds of 40 to 60,000 or more hauled out on beaches in the Bering and Chukchi seas, but only when the total walrus population had grown to a very large size. In other words, land haulouts are natural events and have nothing to do with lack of sea ice or climate change. Pacific walrus appear to have a cyclical boom and bust population history. Numbers increase until they remove all or most of the food that's available on the seafloor. In the 1970s, the population was thought to have reached 200,000 or more, before crashing in the 1980s amid reports of starving animals. But the walrus population has now rebounded from that low point. The most recent estimate puts the total close to 300,000 animals, larger than it was in the 1970s. Haulouts of more than 100,000 walruses have been reported several times since 2009, suggesting the total population size has been very large for at least the last 10 years. In fact, Pacific walrus are doing so well that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service determined in October 2017 that the species had not been harmed by recent sea ice loss and was not expected to be harmed in the foreseeable future. So the enormous beach haulouts of more than 100,000 mothers and calves are not a sign that global warming is causing problems. They are a sign that walruses are thriving. So much for the producers' claims that global warming is a direct cause of walrus deaths. However, there are also disturbing indications that some real causative factors have been kept from viewers. We know from statements made by the show's producers that 2 locations were used for producing the final film: the cliff location and another beach where more than 100,000 walruses were hauled out.
Over 100,000 have hauled out on one single beach.
The footage from the 2 sites were spliced together so seamlessly that the action looks to happen at the same place.
They do so out of desperation, not out of choice.
The commentary reinforces that illusion.
Some manage to find space away from the crowds,
making the viewer think the clifftop action is just around the corner from a huge beach haulout.
They struggle up the 80-meter cliffs,
when in fact it was hundreds of kilometers to the west. Forensic comparison of archive photos with still photos of a falling walrus mean we can be certain that the location where the falling walruses were filmed was near Cape Schmidt in the Russian Far East. Here, the headland of sharp rock falls down to the beach on one side, allowing early arriving walruses to climb up the relatively gentle slope to the top as more animals come ashore behind them. But the cliff is a dangerous place. There are records of walruses being driven over these cliffs by polar bears since at least 2007. And in fact, we know from a report published in the Siberian Times in mid-October 2017 that hundreds of walruses died at this very location sometime in September, when about 20 polar bears approached the walrus herd hauled out there. Film producer Sophie Lanphier has admitted she chose this location in hopes of capturing an image of a walrus falling off the cliff, or of polar bears interacting with the herd.
I guess, how was it to see that? Had you ever seen that kind of situation before?
No, I mean, even now watching it, every time it gets me. We went to that location expecting to maybe film a bit of tumbling down some shallower verges and maybe some polar bears interacting.
Now, when they come ashore, walruses prefer to huddle close together, even when more space is available. But these tightly packed groups are easily startled, and if something like an approaching polar bear, a hunter, or aircraft overhead frightens them, a stampede to the safety of the water can be deadly. The Russian scientific advisor for the Netflix documentary wrote a scientific paper about beach haulouts on nearby Wrangel Island in the 1990s. He concluded that stampedes initiated by polar bears were responsible for most walrus deaths he observed. So it appears that initiating a stampede is a safe and successful way for polar bears to hunt walrus, especially if they are perched on a cliff. All this means that when we look at the final footage of startled walruses falling off a cliff, we have to ask, what agitated them? Before we accept the filmmaker's claim that climate change was to blame, we should know that one of the behind-the-scenes trailers shows a cameraman was on the beach where it rises up to the cliff.
One's going to go, and there's one right on the edge.
Perhaps disturbing the animals at the top, or discouraging them from going back down the way they had come. Overhead shots of the location suggest a drone was used by the film crew. We also know there were polar bears in the area.
These mass gatherings of walrus are now happening almost every year.
The closing scene of the finished film shows a bear approaching from the water to feed on a dead walrus. Any of these potential triggers, or a combination of them, could have precipitated anxious jostling of the animals at the top of the cliff until some began to fall. What we are left with is the film crew insisting that polar bears did not cause the walruses they filmed to fall over the edge, even though we know polar bears were in the area and had caused just such an event perhaps days earlier. We may never know whether the animals were still agitated after the previous disturbance by polar bears, or became worked up again afterwards from the presence of the filmmakers or their drones. Whatever the cause, fatal jostling occurred at the top of the cliff, and perhaps as many as several dozen walruses fell from the cliff top while the crew was present. However, the cameraman panned the walrus bodies below the cliff afterwards and implied that all had died during filming, without any mention of the hundreds that had died when polar bears approached the herd days before. The fact remains, the film crew were hiding critical facts and misrepresenting others to make it appear that the walruses they featured in this episode were responding to lack of sea ice with behavior that was unnatural and unusual. Nothing could be farther from the truth.
They're exhausted because they're having to swim 100 miles now to get to food, and then coming back here because it's the only place to sleep. They used to sleep on the ice, dive down, eat the food, sleep on the ice, easy. And now they're swimming 100 miles, coming to this place, climbing cliffs, and they're just exhausted and falling down and either being killed falling or just crushing each other because there's several thousand crammed onto little tiny bits of beaches.
This is the sad reality of climate change. They'd be on the ice right now if they could be, but there's no option but to come to land. It's just so heartbreaking.
Attenborough utters a completely false statement when he says,
So the lives of walruses, like those of polar bears and seals, are changing. All are living at the frontier of climate change, and all are suffering as a consequence.
just as surely as National Geographic did when it claimed that a video of an emaciated polar bear was what climate change looks like. Walruses haul out in large numbers when their population size is large. They trample each other unintentionally when something spooks them on shore, and sometimes they fall off cliffs in large numbers. Pacific walrus are not being harmed by climate change, but rather they are thriving, just as Arctic seals and polar bears are. Trying to raise the walrus up to icon status using misleading film footage surely indicates the global warming movement is in a desperate state. Townships, cities, and countries around the world have recently declared a state of climate emergency. This summer, the hue and cry of impending doom has reached new heights. Many still emphasize the plight of the polar bear and loss of sea ice in an Arctic warming twice as fast as the rest of the world. It's now September, and Arctic sea ice extent is approaching its low point of the year. After months of media hype, it now seems unlikely that the record-breaking low of 2012 will be exceeded. Polar bears have existed in the Arctic for hundreds of thousands of years, while the animals they depend upon for food, especially ringed and bearded seals, have lived there for millions of years. All have adapted through natural selection to the immense changes in sea ice coverage that occur organically in the Arctic. There have been several periods in the past when Arctic sea ice coverage has been greater than and less than what these animals have experienced in the last decade or so. During the warm Eemian interglacial, just over 100,000 years ago, there was no sea ice at all in the Bering Sea in winter. In contrast, during the last ice age, when massive ice sheets covered most of the northern continents, there was so much thick ice across the Arctic that polar bears and seals were pushed to the edges, where only a narrow band of seasonal ice habitat existed. Consequently, it is not surprising that polar bears, Arctic seals, and walrus have been thriving since sea ice coverage hit a low point in 2007. Low summer sea ice extent is nothing new to these species, no matter what the cause. Contrary to what some scientists claim, ice levels this century have not made a continued decline since 2006. They seem to have stabilized, with some year-to-year variation, after a sudden drop to a new lower level, with no negative consequences for wildlife. Dozens of fat polar bears filmed in Russia in February this year, hyped by news outlets worldwide as victims of climate change, had not been forced ashore by lack of winter ice. They were habituated garbage bears that chose to stay on land the previous fall because they knew there was a reliable food source at the town dump. Starving bears are not victims of climate change either. Starvation is the major cause of death for polar bears, for both older, weaker individuals and young bears with little hunting experience. Isolated examples of skinny bears tell us nothing about the effect of reduced sea ice on survival. What about attacks by bears on people? 2 Canadian Inuit hunters were mauled to death by polar bears last summer, and both incidents were falsely blamed on recent sea ice declines. In truth, the Fox Basin attack survivors waited days for help at the end of August because they were surrounded by so much ice that it took an icebreaker to get to them. The real surprise is that sea ice models used back in 2005 to predict the future extinction of polar bears did not expect such low ice levels to occur until the year 2050. It turned out that not only were these computer model predictions of future sea ice wildly wrong, so were the predictions of future polar bear catastrophe. Polar bear numbers worldwide did not decline as predicted, but instead have increased by at least 16% and probably much more. Polar bears are doing very well in a warmer world. This summer, bears just off the ice have been fat and healthy after gorging on young seals during the spring. Based on the known response of its top predator to almost 50% less ice than there was in 1980, there is no evidence of a climate emergency in the Arctic. Polar bears and other Arctic species are taking reduced summer sea ice in their stride. And if there is no climate emergency in the Arctic, there is no climate emergency anywhere.
Much of the world is on a mission to move away from fossil fuels and towards using renewable sources of energy. Across northern Europe, tens of thousands of wind turbines have been installed at on- and offshore wind farms. From southern Europe to as far north as Germany, vast solar farms have been created on previously agricultural land. The UK has been at the forefront of these developments. In the third quarter of 2018, a third of electricity consumed in Britain was produced from renewable sources. This has been celebrated by environmental organisations, including many of the biggest wildlife conservation charities. They have made calls for increasingly ambitious green policies. The Royal Society for the Protection of Birds, the RSPB, says that renewable energy is essential to protect the world from climate change. The Campaign to Protect Rural England has demanded an expansion of renewable energy. But as they lead our rush into a green energy future, these organisations do not seem to have given much thought to the impact of green energy on wildlife and nature. Wind and solar farms have now been around long enough for a clear picture of their environmental impacts to have emerged. Evidence from around the world shows that wind farms are killing birds. Large upland species seem particularly vulnerable, but many smaller and more common species are also threatened. The impact on bats may be even worse.
When they examined their lungs, they found the blood vessels had burst, causing their lungs to fill up with blood and drown them. Rotating blades leave a drop in air pressure in their wake, so if bats get too close to them, their delicate lungs will expand and explode.
Conservationists are worried that whole populations of bats could be wiped out. Insect species also seem to be at risk. One recent study suggested that each year a significant proportion of migratory insects are crushed by turbine blades. But it's not just collisions that are the problem. Conservationists have observed a barrier effect created by renewable energy installations. Wind turbines and solar panel arrays can prevent animals moving about to find food and shelter. And despite once being thought of as environmentally friendly, the production of biofuels requires the destruction of landscapes and habitats to make room for energy crops. In America, vast areas of forest are being felled so that wood pellets can be burnt in power stations in the UK. These consequences are not what most people would associate with green energy and saving the planet. The problem is that green energy is necessarily land intensive, and this means that many natural landscapes are being dramatically transformed. Wind turbines require foundations with 80 tons of steel and 1,400 tons of concrete. The construction of turbines requires heavy machinery, which in turn requires access roads to be cut through undeveloped natural landscapes. These access roads can total 100 kilometres in length on a single wind farm. Then the turbines and the wind farm must be connected to the grid by power lines, requiring the further destruction of trees and habitats.
This is why CPRE exists, to celebrate our countryside from our farms to our wild areas and the communities that help them to thrive. We want all of us to be able to enjoy our beautiful landscapes, no matter where you live.
All of us here at CPRE would like to say a huge thank you for your incredible support over the past year. Together, we've promoted, enhanced and protected our beautiful countryside so it thrives and enriches all our lives.
Organisations that have made public pledges to protect wildlife and nature have done little to prevent this destruction or to bring it to the attention of the public. Most campaigning organisations lobby for renewables while only occasionally making objections to developments at a local level.
Well, the RSPB has objected to a very, very small proportion of all the wind farm proposals that have come forward.
This seems to give permission for the destruction of bird populations as long as they are not rare species. A remarkable departure from the RSPB's campaigning messages. Conservation groups seem to be sweeping under the carpet the environmental impact of renewables to act as PR campaigns for green energy developers. But how much longer can this last?
One of the proudest achievements of our country is our position as a world leader in tackling this global emergency, being the first country to introduce legally binding carbon reduction targets and cutting emissions further than all the other G20 countries. But as we all know, we now must go further. This report now sets us on a path to become the first major economy in the world to legislate to end our contribution to global warming entirely.
Plans to reduce the UK's net carbon emissions to zero will involve an expansion of renewable energy that dwarfs what we have seen so far. As the amount of land required to meet these policy goals increases, conservationists who depend on public sympathy and financial support for their stated causes will have to justify the policies they have actively supported. Organisations like the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds will have to explain their support for the destruction of habitats and bird populations. Conservation organisations will have to explain why they have used money donated to them not to protect but instead to campaign for the destruction of wildlife, nature and landscapes. To find out more, download the report from the GWPF website.
Drought, flooding and ocean acidification, unanticipated for 65 million years, all result from climate change, according to over 700 of your fellow scientists. So I was wondering whether you thought climate change could be an issue that could unite us all on left and right, moving us beyond debates about C16 to discussions at the UN at Katowice next month, where perhaps humanity might finally discover its global map of meaning.
No. I mean, there's a couple of reasons. I mean, the first reason is that I spent a lot of time reading. I worked for a UN committee for 2 years on sustainable economic and ecological development and read a very large amount during that period of time and learned a lot, much of which made me much more optimistic than I had been before I read the relevant literature, which was a real shock to me. But the climate change issue is an absolutely catastrophic, nightmarish mess, and the idea that that will unite us is that's not going to unite us. I mean, first of all, it's very difficult to separate the science from the politics. And second, even if the claims, the more radical claims are true, we have no idea what to do about it. And so, no. And besides, it's even worse than that. Here's one of the worst things about the whole mess is, so as you project outwards with regards to your climate change projections, which are quite unreliable to begin with, and the unreliability of the measurement magnifies as you move forward in time, obviously, because the errors accumulate. And so if you go out 50 years, the error bars around the projections are already so wide that we won't be able to measure the positive or negative effects of anything we do right now. So how in the world are you going to solve a problem when you can't even measure the consequence of your actions? Like, how is that even possible? And besides that, well, what's the solution? What are we going to do? Switch to wind and solar? Well, good luck with that. Just try it and see what happens. We can't store the power. Germany tried it. They produced more carbon dioxide than they did when they started because they had to turn on their coal-fired plants again. That wasn't a very good plan. Well, we don't want nuclear. It's like, okay, what happens at night? The sun goes down. Well, isn't that something we should have taken into account? Well, we got to flip on the coal-fired plants. Well, so it was a complete catastrophe, and all that happened was the price of electricity shot up. There's like zero utility. So that's not a solution. So what are we going to do about it? Well, we should cut back. We can't consume as much as we are all consuming. It's like, well, maybe, except the data that I've read indicate that if you can get the GDP of people up to about $5,000 a year, then they start caring about the environment, and the environment cleans up. So you could make a perfectly strong case, I think, and a reasonable one, perhaps even a humane one, that the actual idea would be to get everybody in the world who's poor, desperately so, out of poverty as fast as possible, which would increase consumption in the short term, because then they'd start to care about the environment and things would clean up. It's like, okay, well, what are we going to do about global warming? Well, good luck figuring that out. I don't see a solution on the horizon. I look at Bjorn Lomborg's work. I really like Bjorn Lomborg. I think he's a real genius. You can look him up if you want. He took the UN millennial goals. There's 200 of them. That's way too many goals if you're serious about goals, by the way, because 200 goals isn't a plan. It's a wish list. You have to prioritize. I'm serious. You have to prioritize. but they won't prioritize because each of the goals has its constituents, and if you prioritize, then you irritate the constituents, but if you don't prioritize, then you can't implement the plan. So what Lomborg did was gather a teams of economists, multiple teams, some of whom were Nobel Prize winning economists. He had them assemble teams. He had them rank order development goals in terms of their return on investment, all of the teams. Then he averaged across the teams and came up with a final list, and addressing global warming wasn't even on the list. The most fundamental, he wrote a book called How to Spend $75 Billion to Make the World a Better Place, and that's not very much money on a global scale. Almost everything that he recommended had to do with increased child nutrition in developing countries. It's like, these things are complicated, man. These are complicated. It's like, well, let's fix global warming. It's like, okay, well, good luck with that. First of all, how are you going to do that? And to think that will unite us, well, certainly not uniting us so far. So, no. And it's the kind of low-resolution thinking that just gets us absolutely nowhere. I like what Lomborg did way better. I think it's way more intelligent. So, you know, maybe if you increase child nutrition enough and you produce another, I don't know, 10 million geniuses as a consequence of that, and maybe one of them will figure out what to do about global warming. Well, I'm serious about that, you know? It's not a bad thing to increase the total sum of human brain power, you know? And so we treat these things so lightly. Well, let's fix the planet. Well, we're going to concentrate on global warming. Well, why global warming? Well, because everyone thinks that's the biggest catastrophe. Well, maybe it is, but if you don't have a solution, well, and then what about all those other problems? What are you going to do about them? Well, we'll ignore them because we can feel good about, you know, being concerned about global warming. It's like, you know, one of the reasons, there's more trees in the Northern Hemisphere than there were 100 years ago. No one knows that, but it's true, and by a substantial margin. You know why, in part? Because people burned coal instead of wood. It's like everyone says, well, we shouldn't burn coal. It's like, okay, fair enough. What do you want to do, burn trees instead? Because that's what poor people would have done. It's like, coal isn't good. Well, it's better than burning wood. So these things are complicated. So they're unbelievably complicated. And so, no, it's not going to unite us. And we're not going to do a damn thing about it either. So it doesn't really matter. So, well, what are we going to do? You're going to stop, like, having heat? You're going to stop having electricity? You're going to stop driving your cars? You're going to stop taking trains? It's like you're going to stop using your iPhones? You're not going to do any of that. And no wonder. So, no.
Thank you for that.
Third world populations are exploding, but European people aren't having kids. Well, not like third world and non-white populations. Our people are not even replacing themselves with mini-me's. While certain groups openly rejoice in white people declining and think their group is genetically superior and that white people are somehow broken because they don't have 8 kids, the root cause is far more complex, but also very obvious. Reasons why white people aren't having kids. Number 1. Feminism. So-called liberated women have chosen to prioritize school and a career over a family. And even the women that try to do both don't have many kids, and if they do, they're usually stressed out. 2. Climate change propaganda. For years, fake environmentalists blasted messages telling us that it's immoral to have more than one child. They still do, even though we aren't even replacing ourselves. And in fact, you should do your part to save the planet by not having any kids at all. This message, as seen on countless magazine covers and articles, always features white babies in the image. Yet they don't discourage large families among non-Europeans in the West or the third world populations. No, it's immoral to not let them have a big family living it up in the Western world with lots of stuff.
Greece is good, but Greece is no give me home and no have food. I stay here, like one year I stay here and no give me home, no nothing here. I want to go another country.
In my opinion, 80% of the Syrians will stay here in Sweden. When I was in Syria, actually, I had just a Nokia, like a cheap phone. But now I have an iPhone. Here we have like money, job, school.
3. Progressive globalist propaganda has been constantly programming the child-free life to white women. You see it on magazine covers and TV shows constantly. Kids are misery and they hold you down. The child-free life is freedom and a constant party. Sex in the City is where it's at. Yeah, just wait until these women are old and alone.
The birth rate in the United States has been in free fall for years, recently hitting the lowest level ever in American history. That means now about 1 out of every 5 women in their early 40s chooses not to have a child. In more and more cases, it's because women are choosing not to have children because their careers or their lifestyles or because they just don't want to. And the trend is now the focus of the latest issue of Time magazine. You see the headline here, The Child-Free Life. I'm going to start with Verdika because you have chosen not to have children, as I have. When I think back through my life, and I've never wanted to have children, even when I was a child. So I think, well, why would I want to have children? Like, oh, so they can take care of me in my old age. But that's selfish to me.
4. This one just doesn't make sense to me, but it's true for many people. The West has become wealthy and comfortable.
Oh yeah, give me some. Cut me a piece. Oh, you just go away, Baton!
Generally, wealthy people have less kids. They should be having at least 5 as they could easily afford it. Instead, an abundance of materialism usually makes them have fewer children. 5. On the other hand, I hear white people tell me, it's too expensive, they can't afford it. This one I hate hearing. If your struggling, pioneering ancestor said this, you wouldn't be alive. Yes, I know non-Europeans come to our nations, easily claim victim status, get welfare, and have 4 kids. And I know it's much harder for us to get help, but you can make it happen. You don't have to buy all the stuff you think you do. Chances are that you spend that money elsewhere already. Poor white people have always had many kids, and this was before welfare. 6. The most important and damaging reason of all, white guilt. We are being programmed to hate ourselves, hate our ancestors, and feel shame for being who we are. We're told all white people are racist and that mythical white privilege and white supremacy is holding back world peace. All of these are disgusting, hateful lies, but they have done damage in the psyche of white people, starting from a young age. We've been blasted with messages like this. White nuclear families uphold white supremacy. Wanting to preserve your heritage and have children that look like you is racism and world war. So we should welcome and celebrate white people dying out. Celebrate our extinction from the face of the earth.
Whites will not be the majority.
Whiteness is a form of racial oppression.
New Sweden emerging. The immigration process coming toward Europe is irreversible.
It's an exciting transformation of the country.
An unrelenting stream of immigration. Non-stop.
There can be no white race without the phenomenon of white supremacy.
Sweden is destined to become a multiracial, multicultural society.
And the wave still continues. It's not going to stop. Nor should we want it to stop.
Treason to whiteness is loyalty to humanity.
At this point in time, Europe has not yet learned how to be multicultural.
Folks like me who were Caucasian of European descent, for the first time in 2017, will be in an absolute minority.
The task is to bring this minority together in such a way that it makes it impossible for the legacy of whiteness to continue to reproduce itself.
Absolute minority. Fewer than 50% of the people in America, from then and on, will be white European stock.
My concern is doing away with whiteness.
That's not a bad thing. That's a source of our strength.
And I think we're going to be part of the throes of that transformation, which must take place.
It's one of the things I think we can be most proud of.
Europe is not going to be the monolithic societies that they once were in the last century.
Not exactly an ideal condition for bringing up white children, is it? 7. More globalist lies, such as Western civilization wasn't created by Europeans, not by white people. Race doesn't exist. It's all a social construct. So open the borders and welcome your replacements, the new Europeans. Once you're a minority in your nation, nothing will change because people are all the same. Everything will go on as usual. No, in fact, it will be even better if there are less of you. Not exactly a healthy environment that inspires and encourages white people to have a family, is it? 8. Most parents aren't encouraging their daughters to get married and start a family in their 20s. They don't even motivate why this is important and how it will make them fulfilled. If they do want their kids to have kids, they usually say, well, wait until after school. It should be the other way around. 9. Our European governments are also not encouraging white people, their own nation, their own population, to have more children.
Stupid nationalists.
With the exception of Hungary, Russia, Poland, Denmark, places like Germany definitely don't. In fact, they say it's good their own people disappear because, you know, the Nazis. But then say, we need these third world populations of rocket scientists to take care of you when you're old. Don't incentivize having children among your own people, but instead bring in completely foreign and needy people from elsewhere, because that's going to work out great. 10. The future isn't white. We're constantly told that this is inevitable, like a bad voodoo mind trick, that white people are going to die out, so just embrace it and rejoice. It's for the best that people like you don't exist.
This is not going to be the country of white people.
And you can speed that along by having kids who don't look like you. Forget the environment and all that now, because no white people means cleaner air. Mixed race populations in the West are going to save it. Again, incredibly hateful. 11. Multiculturalism, diversity, and immigration. Our societies are less cohesive, less safe, and the hostility against white people is through the roof. This doesn't make white people want to have big families, but in reality, it should give them every reason to have one. 12. I'm going to add religion in this list. European people are less Christian and definitely less pagan, and this factors into fertility rates. It's why Muslims and Catholic Hispanics are having the biggest families in the West, with the exception of some European Catholics, Amish, and Mormons. 13. I know this rings true for many white couples who wish to have more kids. We've lost our village, our tribe, and our large extended families. We've become isolated and lost a folk community to count on, to help each other out, to back each other up. Once that changes, so will birth rates. The fact is, several of these things that I mentioned fall under the UN's definition of genocide. Don't believe me? Let's take a look. In the present convention, genocide means any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group as such. Causing serious mental harm to members of the group. Yes, definitely happening, and some physical, which people deny. Deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. Yes, happening. Measures intended to prevent births within the group. Yes, happening. So it's no surprise, considering these factors, that white birth rates are low. Duh, it's not organic but done by design. White people have lost their confidence and loyalty as a group. White globalists have made their own people enemy number one. They've become cannibals infected by a parasite, and they are completely blind to the hardship they are creating for our children. But of course, the most important thing, a lot of you watching are having many children, and all of this can be very temporary. It's up to you. Numbers will change. Don't let anybody lie and say it's not possible. Populations ebb and flow, decline, and can make a major comeback. That rise, that comeback is in our future, so get on it. Thank you, Red Ice members, for backing this video. We continue because of your support. There are groups who spend all their time and resources trying to silence people like us. So we need your continued support, especially now. Much love. Talk soon.
Liberty. Constitutions, Conservatism, and the Genius of the Founders. An address at the Hillsdale College Constitution Day celebration. 1. Why do we celebrate Constitution Day? Let me start with an incident that happened 30 years ago. When Egyptian President Anwar Sadat was assassinated, the networks ran over to Cairo and began covering the events all day and all night. The only thing I remember of all that coverage was a news anchor bringing in a Middle East expert and saying, "We've just looked at the Egyptian constitution and our researchers tell us that the next in line for the presidency is the Speaker of the Parliament." The Middle East expert burst out laughing and said, "Nobody in Egypt has read the Constitution in 30 years. No one knows it exists, and no one cares what's in it." He asked, "Who's the leader of the military?" The anchor said, "Hosni Mubarak," and the expert said, "He's your next president." Two things struck me about that. First, how naive we are about what constitutions are and what they mean around the world. And the second thing, the reason for the first, is how much reverence we have in the United States and very few other countries for this document. Many things are miraculous about the Constitution. The first is that somehow on this edge of the civilized world 250 years ago, there could have been a collection of such political geniuses as to have actually written it. The second miracle is the actual substance of it, the way that these people, drawing from Locke and Montesquieu and from the Greeks, created an extraordinary political apparatus that a quarter of a millennium later works and has worked with incredible success over these many years. But the third miracle, and the one that I think we appreciate the least, is the fact of the reverence that we have for it. This is as rare as the other two elements that I mentioned. This reverence is so deeply ingrained that we don't even see it. We just think it's in the air that we breathe. But it is extraordinarily rare. It exists in only a handful of countries. For almost all of the world, it is completely alien. Consider the oath of office that we take for granted. I remember taking it 30 years ago and how moved I was by the words and by the idea. Whenever we bestow upon anyone the authority to wield the power of the state over free citizens, we make them swear to protect not the people, not the nation, not the flag, but the Constitution of the United States, a piece of paper. Of course, it stands for the pillars of the American experiment itself, the ideas, the structures, the philosophy that define a limited government with enumerated powers whose mission is to preserve liberty and individual rights. This is a gift, that we intrinsically have this sense of reverence for the Constitution. And it's important to remember that it is a gift from the past. It is not something that we can in any way credit to ourselves. If anything, recent generations have allowed that kind of reverence to diminish, to bleed away over the decades as we try, as it were, to adapt constitutionalism to modernity. What's so remarkable is that constitutions are highly reactionary documents. The very essence of a constitution is to constrain the enthusiasms of a future that one cannot even see. In America, constitutionalism demands that even the most distant progeny swear allegiance to a past embodied in a document written in the late 1780s. If tradition is the democracy of the dead, as G.K. Chesterton had it, then constitutionalism, which is ancient wisdom rendered into legal code, is the tyranny of the dead, the ultimate reach of the past into the future. And in America, it succeeded. The propagandist Lincoln Steffens famously said upon visiting Bolshevik Russia shortly after the revolution, "I have seen the future and it works." American constitutionalism declares, "We have seen the past and it works." Paradoxically, for all the forward-looking blue-sky futuristic spirit of its people, the astonishing stability, majesty, and success of the American experiment owe much to the inherent restraint and conservatism of its original constitutional blueprint. In coming to a close, I'd like to leave you with a more personal reflection. I've always had a sense that there is something providential about American history, and this is from somebody who isn't exactly religious. But starting with the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, here is a nation founded on the edge of civilization, a tiny colony living on the outskirts of the civilized world, that at a time when it needed it, miraculously produced the greatest generation of political thinkers in the history of the world. Then, a century later, when it needed a Lincoln to save the Republic, it found a Lincoln. In the first half of the 20th century, when it needed an FDR to get through the Depression and defeat fascism, it found him. In the second half, when it needed a Reagan to revive the country, he was there. This is not to say that we will always be able to find our way. I don't see or expect or wait for the next great figure. But I do think that what I mentioned earlier, the kind of spontaneous popular reaction we saw against government overreach and in support of constitutional principles, which manifested itself so extraordinarily in these past years, is another sign of hope. There is something about the American spirit, about the bedrock decency and common sense of the American, that seems to help us find our way, something about American history that redeems itself in a way that inspires us all. I would summarize it by quoting my favorite pundit, Otto von Bismarck. Not known for his punditry, but he is famously said to have said, "God looks after children, drunkards, idiots, and the United States of America." I think he still does. I hope he still does.
We know that our country is divided, but I think we're using an old template to describe how it's divided. I stopped using the word liberal a long time ago because there's nothing liberal about the left. They oppose free speech, free thought, free markets, freedom of religion. The only freedoms they support are the unbridled fulfillments of physical desires, which are guaranteed to turn you into a dependent slave. So I call them leftists now, but maybe leftist isn't quite right either. It's kind of an old-fashioned word to describe a European phenomenon. And what about conservatives? Are we really conservative? Well, we're sort of conservative, but in America, conservatives aren't about blood and soil or even really about tradition necessarily, except insofar as our traditions preserve our essential American ideas. Unlike conservatives in other nations, American conservatives are trying to conserve the most radical political document ever written, the Constitution, which guarantees a limited government of specified powers tasked with guaranteeing the individual's right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So that's not really conservative in the usual sense of the word. In fact, what I think we're seeing is a division between friends of that founding and enemies of that founding. Those of us who believe the creation of the United States in the image of our Declaration and Constitution is the greatest political event in history and therefore worth saving, and those who think no, we should return to the age-old habit of top-down government or race-based identity politics rather than the radical politics based on our founding ideas. You can tell friends of the founding because they talk about founding ideals. They quote Jefferson, they quote Madison, Adams, Franklin. They wrestle with the original intentions of the Constitution and the underlying principles of the Declaration. We can have passionate but civilized debates about whether a new idea, like gay rights, is antithetical to those founding intentions or, in fact, in keeping with them. Because we have source materials and writings and foundational ideas, we can compare our arguments and then move ahead, abandoning out-of-date practices or clinging to those practices that still hold true to the founding. But the anti-founders, they got nothing. All they have is an amorphous sense of their own glowing compassion, tolerance, and virtue. So they use empty phrases like, "That's not who we are," which literally means nothing. They invent mean-sounding words like Islamophobia or transphobia, which describe utterly non-existent phenomena. Nobody's phobic about transgender people or Islamic people. They just want to demonize legitimate concerns about whether violence is inherent in Islamic theology and whether so-called sexual identity is eating away at morality and even sanity. They address issues of high emotion and zero importance, like use of pronouns or abortion rights for girls who are actually guys. They're guided and manipulated by emotive pictures on the left-wing news. Babies dying at the border is a crisis, but babies dying in Chicago, not so much. Most of all, the enemies of the founding define everything that opposes them as hate. Of course they do. Since they're defined by their love and their virtue, anyone who's against them must be hateful and therefore can be opposed by any means necessary. So the enemies of the founding call the friends of the founding not just wrong, but evil, and they license their own evil in the process. They call us hateful while they obviously seethe with hate. They call us violent while they assault us and scream at us and spit on us in restaurants. They call us racist while they see everything in terms of race. And they call us fascist while they try to undermine every freedom our founding defends. Momentary issues and the huge presence of Donald Trump distract us from the essential nature of this division. But in each issue, each crisis, each argument, it's important to remember what exactly we're fighting for so we can defeat these forces of violence and hate.
They use their media to assassinate real news. They use their schools to teach children that their president is another Hitler. They use their movie stars and singers and comedy shows and award shows to repeat their narrative over and over again. And then they use their ex-president to endorse the resistance, all to make them march, make them protest, make them scream racism and sexism and xenophobia and homophobia, to smash windows, burn cars, shut down interstates and airports, bully and terrorize the law-abiding, until the only option left is for the police to do their jobs and stop the madness. And when that happens, they'll use it as an excuse for their outrage. The only way we stop this, the only way we save our country and our freedom, is to fight this violence of lies with the clenched fist of truth. I'm the National Rifle Association of America, and I'm freedom's safest place.
What makes America's military the most fearsome force on earth isn't just the weapons, equipment, or technology. It's the flag beneath which we serve. From the shores of Tripoli and Normandy to the jungles of Vietnam and the streets of Baghdad and Kandahar, America's armed forces fight with courage, selflessness, and noble purpose unmatched and undefeated. We've always known that behind our line stands every hope for human freedom on this earth. So let me say this to all who serve or who have served. If you want to continue your fight to keep freedom alive, there's a nearly 6 million member force that would be truly proud to add your name to our ranks. I'm the National Rifle Association of America, and I'm freedom's safest place.
We understand we live in a dangerous world. The enemies of freedom are real, and we need to be ready to defend all of our freedoms.
Freedom to me is ability to live how I see fit to live.
That's exactly what this country was founded on, was freedom. It is in danger.
The elites and their ideology are destroying this country. We're losing the America that we all love.
Gun rights are under assault.
It's important that we fight for our freedom.
We're at a critical stage.
We are freedom's safest place.
The Second Amendment, after freedom of speech and religion, it was the first thing our founding fathers thought of. That is the pinnacle of freedom.
It's about my safety, and I'm going to fight for my safety.
I love the freedom that I have. I'm appreciative of the NRA for fighting for that freedom.
And they're on the front lines doing something to defend our rights and the voice of the people.
It protects law-abiding citizens.
The work that the NRA does is important, preserving freedom and liberty.
Keeping people informed, raising awareness about what's going on in the country.
They are the protector of our freedoms.
The NRA stands for freedom.
In the face of this relentless onslaught of gun control schemes, you're the reason the Second Amendment still stands. You're the tip of the spear.
You're the ones that make it possible for us every day to defend this freedom.
They're fighting for our fundamental freedoms. I mean, I can't think of anything more important than that.
One person to politicians in Washington is nothing, but together, as members of the NRA, we actually can have a voice.
We must lead the way, and we must save our freedom.
We're going to fight for the America we believe in. This is a fight for our freedom.
We need to reawaken the passion and pride and unity of purpose that made this country so special.
We're the National Rifle Association of America. We're born to fight, and we're not going anywhere.
Stand up if you want to protect your right to protect yourself. Stand up if you believe in freedom. Stand up and every day speak out. And we're going to stand for freedom and fight. We will not be silent.
I think my dog's a Democrat, and it breaks my heart to have to say an ugly thing like that. But there's a big old pile of evidence that all points towards the fact my dog might be a Democrat. I pay for all his health care, and I buy everything he eats. I provide him with a place to live just to keep him off the streets. But he just acts like he's entitled, even tried to unionize the cat. Yeah, I think my dog's a Democrat. He chewed up the Constitution that I keep on display, and every time Benghazi's on TV, he looks the other way.
What difference at this point does it make?
I know he's a liberal, even if he won't admit it. He pooped on my living room rug and tried to tell me George Bush did it. He ain't got no papers, and what really gets my goat is if he could find a ride to town, well, I know they'd let him vote. Well, sure, we've had some good times, and he's been fun to have around. But if he ever barks about my right to bear arms, I'm gonna have him put down. Who's a good boy? Who's a good boy? I pay for all his health care, and I buy everything he eats. I provide him with a place to live just to keep him off the streets. You'd have to be a socialist to ever act like that. So my dog must be a Democrat. His behavior has been hinting that his mom might be Mrs. Clinton. Yeah, I think my dogs spread the wealth, government health, flea-bitten Democrat.